Hi, I'm John Van Sommeren, and this is one of the in-house software training modules. This module is an introduction to tenant transactions. It describes the tenant transactions menu and shows you which forms to use when a tenant owes money to his landlord and which to use when he pays his debt. There's also a more complicated aspect to tenant transactions to do with recurring payments, like a standing order, but that's covered by another module. So, on with the show. This slide is here because I was taught to say what I'm going to say. That's this slide. Say it. That's the next half dozen slides. And say what I said. That's the summary at the end. We have tenant accounts. These are like bank accounts, and I describe them. I explain what is a transaction. You get to see the form used in the in-house software to post a transaction, and in fact you see me posting a couple of transactions, and then I show and explain how to use the tenant statements of account. The tenant account. Each tenant's tenant account is used to record that tenant's debts to the landlord and the payment he or she makes to repay those debts. There's no special form for opening a tenant account in the in-house software. It's automatically opened as soon as the first transaction is posted in it. Once opened, it remains in the in-house software forever. You will see below that there are 4 categories of tenant account, one for each of the reasons why a tenant might owe money, so each tenant can have up to 4 tenant accounts. The categories are top-up, for tenants who are working and therefore their housing benefit payment is less than their rent. Utilities. Some of the properties don't have gas and electricity meters, and this category records the monthly lump sum the tenants have to pay to their landlord. Even if the tenants pay metered utility bills, a few properties offer Wi-Fi for a fixed monthly payment. Rent in advance. This is not a normal account, this is a savings account. If a tenant is considered a good risk, the landlord can volunteer to forego the lump sum rent in advance, or maybe accept a smaller amount, and the tenant promises to pay the rest in installments. Miscellaneous. This is used for all other reasons for owing money, but breakages is a common one. So, what is a transaction? A transaction is a debit or credit entry in a tenant's account. It's as simple as that. If the tenant owes the landlord £45, you, acting for the landlord, must post a debit transaction of £45 to the account, and if the tenant hands in his keys and wants his rent in advance back, anyone can see that he owes the landlord £45. If and when the tenant pays up, you must post a credit transaction of £45 to the account. The net result is a tenant's account with a zero balance, showing that nobody owes anybody anything. In the example used in this training module, the tenant has broken a window which costs £45 to replace. You will see how to post a debit of £45 in order to show the debt, and you will see how to post a credit of £45 when the money is received. The next slide shows both these transactions being posted at the same time. In reality, they would have been posted 2 weeks apart. Here is the Tenant Transactions menu, which is new in version 7 and replaces the one that was called Accounting. Down here we have the Tenant Transactions Register, which is unchanged from when it was on the Accounting menu. Managed Transactions is a new form for this version 7, and we'll be using that in a moment. The Manage Recurring Payments, the Recurring Payments Dashboard, and the Recurring Payments Toolbox are all covered in another module about recurring payments. So, straight to Manage Transactions. It's the standard datasheet form used all over the in-house software. It starts off by being full of all the transactions of all the tenants in the system. If that's too many, you can use the Select a Tenant button in order to reduce the clutter, and if there's still too many, you can reduce the clutter further by selecting only one of the categories of transaction. I want to key a transaction in for Mr. Fagan, who's broken a window, so I'll select him. And in fact, there are no transactions for him at all. Adding transactions is the simplest of things. I advise you not to use the mouse once you've clicked in New. Now use the tab key just to tab across. He broke the window on the 1st of July, and that's the value date. The fact that the glazier didn't send in his bill for a couple of days and it took a couple of weeks to pay it, nonetheless the debt was incurred on the 1st of July. It's a debt, so we want a debit. There's no housing benefit reference number because it's not a top-up. There's no reference transaction ID necessary for debits, and the amount was £45. Category miscellaneous, and the description broken window. That will get saved as soon as I click off the row. So I'm going to click down here once to save the record. You can see here that the actions have now been added. That shows it's saved. And I'll click here a second time to show that I want another transaction. Now, in real life, this would have happened 2 weeks later when Mr. Fagan sent the money. It showed up in the bank statement, perhaps, and that was on the 15th of July. It's a credit. The reference transaction ID. We'll learn column by column about this form on the next few screens, but here is a number allocated by the system to every transaction, and I want to put in the credits transaction. I want to put in a cross-reference to the transaction ID of the debit. So I'm going to put in 2171. You don't need the X. That's a bit like the sterling symbol in the currency amount. £45. Miscellaneous, again I'm just typing an M to make it simple, and broken window. Now that will get saved as soon as I click on the close button so that you can see it happening. I'm going to use the Control S key combination. You can use this everywhere in the in-house system when you just want to save the data as it is on screen and yet remain on the form. Control S. You'll see that the action has been added, so both those transactions, the debit and the credit, are in the system, and we can close it. The statement of account. You've just seen how to post transactions. This slide shows you how to display them in the report called the statement of account. This is exactly like the statement of account you get from your own bank. We're still on the same form. Use the tenant statement button up here to print a statement for the current tenant's miscellaneous account. This drop-down combo box always shows the category of account for the currently selected transaction. You can change it to any other category before you click on the button to produce the statement. You will see these same statement buttons on many other forms, specifically the Transactions Toolbox and the Housing Benefit Toolbox form. If you're wondering why there are two buttons, the tenant statement shows all the transactions in the chosen account category, but the chase-up statement shows only the transactions for the single recurring payment you are chasing. This sample tenant statement comes from the two transactions I've just posted. Notice that it is a report, not a form, so that it can be printed. Just use the right mouse click. Up here is the customer's name and address. Over here are the details of his current tenancy. Between these two black lines are the column headings, and you can see the two transactions that I've just entered. There's no facility at the moment to select from and to dates. The statement shows all transactions posted during this guy's tenancy. Indeed, if the tenant has transferred from another property, the statement will only show the current address, but it will show all transactions for both properties. In this case, you can use the value date column, comparing it to the tenancy start date for the current address, to determine if any particular transaction belongs to the current tenancy or a previous one. A transaction's components. On this and the next slide, I'm going to look at each of the columns quite specifically and show you the importance of each one. ID. This, in fact, is the transaction ID, and it's a unique reference number given to every transaction. You will see the X prefix. You will have seen client, property, and tenancy IDs elsewhere, but you seldom have to remember them. could talk about a client or property by name, but I'm afraid transactions have no similar distinguishing feature. Sometimes you just have to remember the transaction ID. Tenancy ID, just double-click on the tenancy ID and that'll take you through to the Manage Tenancies form. Value date. For a debit, this is the date the debt arose. This example has the tenant breaking the window on the 1st of July. Maybe you didn't get the glazier's bill until the day after, and it took another week to pay it. But the debt arose the day the window was broken, so that's the value date. For a credit, the value date is the date the tenant's payment was recorded on the landlord's bank account as income, the 15th of July in this case. If the tenant paid cash, it's the date the tenant paid the cash, the date of the receipt. Transaction code, debit or credit. If you're tabbing across the screen, doing it the easy way, just type D or C and tab on to the next column. HB, this is the housing benefit number, which you'll find on the housing benefit dashboard and the housing benefit toolbox. You'll only use the housing benefit number for payments made into a tenancy top-up. Reference. RefXID is a shorthand for Reference Transaction ID, and it's only used on credit transactions. Go find the debit transaction that caused this debt. Here we are, X1789, and type the number in here as the Reference Transaction ID. The computer doesn't use this information, but it will provide the answer when the tenant asks a year later, "Why did I give you this £45? Amount? Well, just type the amount. If it's a debit, you'll find the computer displays it in red. And category, if you're using the tab key, just type the initial letter of the category. The remainder of the columns we'll discuss on the next slide. We're still looking at the individual components of a transaction, column by column. The description. The computer can accept 40-50 words in a description, but remember, the statement only has room for 4 or 5 words. Bank reference and bank date and payee. These are cross-references to the bank statement, the checkbook counterfoil, or the paying-in book. Actions. These are inserted automatically by the computer. Well, that's about it for the simple side of tenant transactions. So, let me summarize what the previous slides have said. The in-house software contains a tenant account in any one of 4 categories whenever a tenant owes money to the landlord. Debit and credit transactions are posted to the account using the form Tenant Transaction Posting, and in fact, it's posting the first of these tenant transactions that actually opens the account. There's no special form for doing that. The tenant statement is the easiest way to see all the transactions on a tenant's account for a particular category. At the moment, there's no facility to show all categories on the one statement, nor is there the ability to select start and end dates for the statement. The statement can be printed and mailed to the tenant with a covering letter. This introduction has not described any of the range of features provided for recurring payments. These are covered in a separate training module. That's it. Thank you for listening to me. Send email feedback to me on john@freshstarthousing.org.uk.